When we talk about the rise of China, too many people look at the story in fragments. They see headlines about booming factories, crowded ports, and a middle class that grew faster than any in history. They reduce the narrative to cheap labor, mass exports, and state-driven construction projects. But the reality is far more complex, far more intentional, and far more deliberate than most outside observers have ever understood. China's rise was not an accident of history. It was not the lucky outcome of globalization or the passive result of foreign investment. It was the product of a carefully constructed, long-term strategy that was laid down over decades, brick by brick, decision by decision, with patience that most nations could never sustain. In the late 20th century, as the Cold War wound down, the world was busy watching the collapse of the Soviet Union. Attention was fixed on Russia, Europe, and America's newfound dominance. Yet in the background, China's leadership was quietly analyzing the mistakes of others. They studied how the Soviet system had crumbled under inefficiency and overreach, how the West had become addicted to consumerism, and how short-term politics often blinded leaders to long-term realities. From this study, a blueprint began to emerge. China's leaders recognized that survival in the modern age would not come from military confrontation or ideological battles. It would come from economic power, industrial control, and the ability to weave oneself into the fabric of global trade so tightly that no rival could cut them out without bleeding themselves dry. The transformation began with something that appeared simple: opening the door. Special economic zones like Shenzhen were not just experiments in capitalism. They were laboratories for a new model of growth. Factories were built not merely to assemble products for foreign companies, but to absorb technology, methods, and knowledge. Every contract signed with a foreign corporation was not only a business deal, but also a lesson. Every machine imported was a teacher. The West thought it was using China for cheap labor. In reality, China was using the West to train an entire generation in modern industrial practice. This is why the story of China's rise cannot be told as a random series of events. It was a ladder built deliberately. At the lowest rung, China offered labor. At the next rung, they mastered supply chains. Higher up, they created domestic companies that could rival the foreign ones. And now they are on the top rungs, innovating, setting global standards, and even leading in critical technologies like artificial intelligence, green energy, and 5G networks. Every step of this ladder was anticipated long before the world recognized the climb. Another critical aspect of this hidden strategy was patience. Western economies often live and die by election cycles, corporate quarters, and shareholder reports. But China's vision extended beyond 5 years, 10 years, even 20 years. They were willing to sacrifice short-term comfort for long-term positioning. Infrastructure was built not for immediate profit, but for strategic necessity. High-speed rail networks, ports, and highways were laid down not only to move goods faster, but to create the backbone of a self-sustaining empire of trade. While other nations debated costs, China absorbed them as investments in inevitability. Education was another cornerstone. China didn't just send students abroad to learn. It sent them as scouts, as future architects of national capacity. These students absorbed everything from engineering to finance, from software to international law, and then returned home to replicate, adapt, and improve. Over time, this built a reservoir of human capital that could rival any in the world. Factories alone do not build nations. People do. China understood this truth and nurtured it in silence. We also need to look at how culture and discipline played a role. The willingness of the population to endure decades of rapid industrialization, environmental costs, And the hardships of transformation cannot be separated from the state's long-term vision. This wasn't accidental resilience. It was the result of a national mindset that emphasized collective progress over individual gain. That kind of unity, whether through tradition, control, or shared aspiration, allowed China to execute a strategy that would have collapsed in societies too fractured by individualism. Then there is the question of timing. China knew when to step forward and when to stay silent. In the early years, they downplayed their ambitions, presenting themselves as a developing nation simply trying to catch up. They allowed the world to underestimate them, to view them as the world's workshop rather than a competitor. This disguise bought them time to build, to expand, to learn. By the time the world began to recognize the scale of their rise, China was already too embedded in global supply chains, too essential to global trade, and too advanced in certain sectors to be stopped without enormous self-inflicted damage. Consider also the Belt and Road Initiative. On the surface, it is infrastructure development across Asia, Africa, and beyond. But look deeper and you see another layer of the strategy, binding dozens of countries to China through roads, ports, and loans, creating a web of influence that cannot be easily undone. This is not charity. This is positioning. It is creating future markets, future allies, and future dependencies. China's hidden strategy also involved controlling resources, not just material ones like rare earth minerals, but also digital and informational resources. By building their own platforms, their own internet giants, and their own surveillance and data systems, they reduced dependence on foreign technology. They created parallel systems that could withstand external shocks. In doing so, they secured a form of sovereignty that goes beyond borders and into the invisible realm of data and code, the new battleground of power. All of this makes one point clear. China's rise was engineered with precision. It was not the outcome of chance. It was not luck that transformed a rural agrarian society into the world's second largest economy within a single generation. It was the result of a vision so comprehensive that outsiders could not see the full picture until it was already in motion. And even today, many still do not see it for what it is. They look at numbers and trade disputes, but they fail to recognize the architecture behind it. The hidden scaffolding of decades of planning, sacrifice, and calculated moves. This is why when we say China's rise wasn't accidental, we mean it in the deepest sense. Every stage, every move, every silence, and every action was part of a design that others were too distracted to notice. And this design continues to evolve, reshaping the world in ways that go far beyond economics. When the world looked at China during the late 20th century, the prevailing assumption in the West was that its rise would be limited, chaotic, and fragile. Politicians, analysts, and business leaders spoke confidently about how Western values, systems, and institutions would remain the ultimate benchmark of global success. They believed that China's controlled governance, its centralized economic planning, and its strict discipline would eventually collapse under the pressure of modernization and global integration. What they failed to understand was that this very discipline, this very patience, and this quiet strategic silence were the pillars upon which China's resurgence was being constructed. The West underestimated these qualities because they did not fit into the Western imagination of how power is supposed to grow. They assumed noise equals strength. They assumed declarations equal dominance. They assumed that global leadership required constant self-promotion. China quietly proved otherwise. Discipline has always been a core element of China's strategic DNA. From the earliest stages of reform, there was a clear willingness to prioritize long-term goals over immediate comforts. Factories were built in conditions that outsiders would have labeled intolerable, yet the workers endured because they understood the larger narrative. Sacrifice now for a stronger tomorrow. Environmental damage, social strain, and urban overcrowding were accepted realities because the leadership framed them as temporary costs on the road to revival. This was not a society obsessed with instant gratification. It was a society conditioned to endure, to wait, to persist. That discipline gave China the power to sustain projects and policies that in other nations would have been abandoned at the first sign of public discontent. The West, on the other hand, was locked into short cycles. Politicians thought in terms of four-year elections, corporations thought in terms of quarterly profits, and media thought in terms of 24-hour headlines. This created a culture of urgency, a hunger for immediate validation, and an inability to commit to visions that would take decades to bear fruit. Infrastructure projects that stretched over 10 or 20 years were considered politically dangerous in Western democracy. Spending on research and education that would not yield results for a generation was often cut in favor of more immediate gains. In this environment, China's patience became a weapon. While Western leaders made loud declarations of victory or dominance, China quietly prepared for realities that would not arrive for another 20 or 30 years. Silent planning was perhaps the most underestimated aspect of all. China rarely announced its true ambitions until they were already partially achieved. When they launched their first wave of industrial modernization, they presented it as a simple effort to provide jobs. When they built high-speed rail, they framed it as domestic infrastructure. When they developed digital platforms, they spoke of serving their citizens. Yet behind these modest declarations was a deeper plan to use each project not just to meet a need, but to position China for leverage in the future. By the time outsiders understood the scope of these moves, the systems were already too advanced, too widespread, and too critical to global functioning to be challenged without massive costs. This silence created an asymmetry of knowledge. The West believed it knew the rules of the game, but the real rules were being rewritten quietly behind the scenes. The discipline of the Chinese system also extended into governance. The ability to enforce long-term policies without being derailed by populist movements or partisan divides gave China a consistency that democracies often lacked. Leaders could commit to 50-year plans, and those plans could survive leadership transitions. This continuity is what allowed strategies like the Belt and Road Initiative to unfold with such precision. The West, fragmented by political swings and cultural divisions, mocked such projects as overreach or vanity, until they realized these same projects had locked dozens of countries into China's economic orbit. Silence was not weakness, it was cover. Patience was not hesitation, it was preparation. Discipline was not rigidity, it was resilience. Even in moments of crisis, these qualities distinguished China from its rivals. When global recessions struck, when trade wars erupted, when pandemics spread, China often appeared composed, measured, and unhurried. The West, in contrast, reacted loudly, dramatically, and often inconsistently. This difference in behavior reinforced the imbalance. One side seemed always on the defensive, explaining, justifying, declaring. The other side advanced without noise, letting actions speak years later when results could no longer be denied. The underestimation of patience also reveals a deeper cultural misunderstanding. In many Western societies, speed is equated with progress. A leader who acts slowly is labeled indecisive. A nation that moves gradually is assumed to be weak. But in Chinese strategy, time is not an enemy. Time is an ally. Waiting, is not wasted energy. It is accumulation. Delaying a confrontation does not mean avoiding it forever. It means choosing the battlefield carefully. This patience has allowed China to avoid costly mistakes and to step into opportunities only when the conditions were optimal. The West kept expecting a clash, a declaration, a bold announcement that China was mated to claim global leadership. That moment never came. Instead, leadership emerged through 1,000 small steps that no one took seriously until it was too late. This news offers a clear example. Western corporations rushed into China for quick profits, assuming that their size and power would guarantee permanent advantage. They underestimated how Chinese companies watched, learned, and adapted with discipline. For years, Western executives declared their dominance in China, boasting about market share and growth. Then, almost silently, local companies overtook them. The discipline to absorb knowledge, the patience to build alternatives, and the silence to mask ambitions created a reversal few had predicted. What looked like foreign control became domestic control, and what looked like Western expansion became Chinese consolidation. This same pattern is visible in technology. The West laughed at early Chinese attempts to build domestic software e-commerce platforms or mobile networks. They were seen as inferior imitations of American and European giants. Yet over time, discipline turned these experiments into innovations. Patience transformed small markets into global ones. And silence concealed just how powerful these ecosystems were becoming. Today, many of these platforms are not just competitive, but dominant in regions beyond China's borders. The underestimated has become the unavoidable. And so, the very qualities that the West dismissed, discipline, patience, silent planning, became the forces that outmaneuvered declarations, press releases, and noisy claims of superiority. The West believed strength was measured by volume, by how loudly one could proclaim victory. China showed that true strength could move quietly, without slogans, without announcements, without demands for recognition. What was once seen as weakness revealed itself as a new model of power that thrived not on spectacle, but on results, not on declarations, but on endurance, not on noise, but on silence. The old Great Wall was built stone by stone to keep invaders out, a monumental display of defense that stood as both a shield and a symbol of endurance. In today's world, walls are no longer built from brick and mortar. They are constructed from code, platforms, and networks. For China, the 21st century demanded a new form of fortification, one that could not only protect its sovereignty from foreign dominance, but also project its influence outward in ways that weapons and armies could not achieve. Technology and digital ecosystems became that wall. They became the invisible fortification behind which China secured its independence from Western control, while simultaneously pushing its influence into the lives, habits, and economies of billions of people around the globe. In the early days of the internet, the West believed it had a permanent advantage. Silicon Valley was the undisputed epicenter of innovation, and American platforms dominated global digital life. China, at that stage, seemed like a peripheral player, a consumer of Western technology rather than a producer. But once again, appearances were deceiving. While Western companies rushed to expand abroad, chasing profits and recognition, China quietly erected barriers. The Great Firewall was derided in Western media as censorship. But beneath that surface criticism lay something more strategic. By restricting the dominance of foreign platforms, China created the breathing space necessary to cultivate its own. Without Facebook, WeChat grew Without Google, Baidu expanded. Without Amazon, Alibaba thrived. Each restriction was not just about information control, it was about economic sovereignty. Every foreign competitor that was slowed gave rise to a domestic alternative that could grow without being crushed under Western giants. This digital sovereignty was the foundation of a broader strategy. It ensured that China's technological infrastructure was not dependent on foreign systems that could be manipulated or weaponized against it. While Western nations celebrated the idea of an open internet, China recognized the risks of reliance. They built their own platforms, their own standards, and their own digital ecosystems that could operate independently of external pressures. Over time, these ecosystems did more than protect. They innovated. WeChat, for instance, became not just a messaging service, but an entire digital universe combining payments, communication, commerce, and even governance. Such integration was rarely seen in Western equivalents, and it gave China both resilience and an unparalleled tool for shaping daily life at home and abroad. Technology also became the spearhead of China's global influence. Infrastructure projects were one part of the Belt and Road Initiative, but digital infrastructure was another. By exporting 5G networks, surveillance systems, and fintech platforms to developing countries, China extended its digital wall outward, binding nations into its technological orbit. For many of these countries, Chinese technology was not just affordable but essential, offering them access to systems that Western providers either withheld or overcharged. Each adoption strengthened China's influence and weakened Western dominance. What looked like business was in fact strategy. Every router installed, every app downloaded, and every platform adopted became another stone in this new Great Wall, a wall that encircled not just China but entire regions of the globe. The symbolic nature of this digital wall should not be overlooked. The old Great Wall projected power through visibility. Everyone could see its scale. The new wall projects power through invisibility. It is woven into transactions, communications, and networks that most people do not even notice. Yet its presence is constant. When a consumer in Africa pays through a Chinese mobile system, when a government in Asia relies on Chinese surveillance technology, when a company in Europe sources products through Chinese e-commerce networks, they are interacting with the wall. It is no longer about keeping invaders out, but about ensuring others remain within the orbit of China's technological reach. Western analysts underestimated this shift. They believed that military strength or trade wars could determine dominance in the modern age. But China understood that the digital realm was where the true battles would be fought. Whoever controlled data would control the future. Whoever built platforms would shape behavior. Whoever mastered ecosystems would dictate dependence. This is why China invested so heavily in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, green technologies, and digital payments. These were not side projects. They were the new fortifications of sovereignty. They ensured that no matter what pressure was applied, China could resist, adapt, and expand. The construction of this digital wall also required cultural adaptation. Citizens had to embrace domestic platforms wholeheartedly, and they did. The integration of digital tools into everyday life in China far outpaced adoption in many Western societies. From ordering food to paying rent to scheduling medical appointments, digital ecosystems in China became indispensable. This rapid integration meant that Chinese platforms were not merely alternatives, they were essential infrastructures. Once dependence is created, displacement becomes nearly impossible. Western companies trying to re-enter or compete found themselves locked out, not by regulation alone, but by the sheer entrenchment of local platforms in daily life. Another critical element of this ecosystem was the combination of state support and entrepreneurial drive. Unlike the West, where governments often clash with their largest tech firms, China aligned its digital ambitions with state policy. Tech companies were given room to innovate, but their growth was always tied to national goals. Whether in expanding global payment systems, advancing AI research, or exporting digital infrastructure, these companies operated not just as businesses, but as extensions of state strategy. This alignment gave China a cohesion that Western rivals lacked, turning every innovation into both a profit engine and a geopolitical tool. The resilience of this wall was tested repeatedly. Trade wars, sanctions, and attempts to isolate Chinese companies only reinforced the determination to expand technological sovereignty. When certain companies were targeted and cut off from Western technology, the response was not collapse, but acceleration. Domestic industries doubled their efforts to close the gaps, and the crisis became an opportunity for growth. This adaptability revealed another strength of the digital wall. It was not static. Unlike the old Great Wall, which could crumble under neglect or invasion, this wall evolved. It repaired itself, expanded itself, and adapted itself to new realities. Every attack only made it stronger. Globally, the spread of Chinese digital ecosystems has altered the balance of power. Nations that once relied exclusively on Western platforms now find themselves tied to Chinese alternatives. For some, this is a matter of convenience. For others, it is necessity. But in every case, it extends China's influence without deploying a single soldier. Power is no longer measured solely in armies or GDP, but in how many people's lives depend on your networks, your code, your systems. By that measure, China has built an empire that stretches far beyond its borders, an empire guarded not by stone watchtowers, but by algorithms, servers, and digital platforms. The untold truth of this transformation is that technology has become both shield and sword. It protects China from external domination, while simultaneously allowing it to project power in subtle, almost invisible ways. Where armies would provoke fear, platforms provoke reliance. Where borders once defined strength, ecosystems now define control. And while the West still debates how to respond, a wall has already been built, the networks already established, the dependence already created. This new Great Wall stands not on the hills of northern China, but in the digital landscapes of the entire world, reshaping the balance of power in ways that traditional eyes still struggle to recognize. Throughout history, empires rose and fell on the strength of their armies, the reach of their navies, and the iron grip of their territorial expansions. But in the modern world, wars are rarely won through weapons alone. Power today flows not from the barrel of a gun, but from the arteries of commerce, the veins of supply chains, and the invisible ties of trade that bind nations together. China understood this truth long before most of its rivals. Where others continued to pour resources into military dominance and loud dollars of supremacy, China quietly wove itself into the fabric of global trade so intricately that to pull away would mean self-inflicted harm. Dependence on Chinese manufacturing, Chinese markets, and Chinese infrastructure has become the silent weapon of our age, one that no army can counter and no missile can deter. This weapon is not forged in steel, but in necessity. Every time a company in Europe orders microchips, every time a retailer in America restocks its shelves with consumer goods, every time a factory in Africa or South America relies on Chinese machinery to keep its production running, another strand of this dependence is reinforced. It is not dramatic, not explosive, not even immediately visible, but its power lies precisely in that invisibility. Nations do not realize the depth of their reliance until a disruption occurs. until a shipment is delayed, a supply chain is fractured, or a contract is suspended. Only then does the silent weapon reveal itself, not as an act of aggression, but as a reminder of where true leverage lies. The story of this dependence begins with the industrial transformation of China itself. Factories became not just centers of production, but nodes in a global network that stretched across continents. Western corporations thought they were using China for cheap labor and easy profits. But in reality, China was using them to secure a permanent role in the world's economic bloodstream. By making itself indispensable to global production, China ensured that every multinational corporation, every retailer, and every government became entangled in its rise. When profits soared from Chinese supply chains, these same corporations became silent advocates for continued engagement, lobbying their own governments to maintain ties, even when political tensions escalated. In this way, economic dependence became not just a weapon, but a shield, protecting China from unified opposition. The brilliance of this strategy lies in its dual nature. On one hand, China is the world's factory, producing everything from electronics to textiles, medicines to machinery. On the other, China has built itself into one of the largest consumer markets on the planet, a prize that no foreign company can afford to lose. This dual leverage means that countries are tied to China not only because they buy from it, but also because they sell to it. For Western corporations, China's growing middle class represents billions of dollars in potential revenue. To walk away from that market would be to cripple their own growth. In this way, dependence is reinforced from both directions, a web so dense that escape becomes nearly impossible without immense sacrifice. When global crises occur, this weapon becomes even more visible. During supply chain disruptions, it becomes clear just how much of the world depends on the smooth operation of Chinese ports, shipping routes, and manufacturing hubs. A delay in Shenzhen ripples across oceans. A shutdown in Shanghai sends shockwaves into boardrooms in New York and London. Unlike traditional weapons, which destroy through force, this weapon reveals its strength through absence. The inability to access goods, components, or markets can cause more damage to an economy than any bomb or battle. And yet, it is not framed as an attack, but as a logistical reality, a fact of interdependence that no military can solve. The Belt and Road Initiative expanded this dependence beyond trade in goods by building infrastructure across Asia, Africa, and Europe. China linked dozens of nations directly into its economic orbit. Roads, ports, and railways financed by Chinese loans and constructed by Chinese companies do more than facilitate trade. They create reliance. Countries that accept this infrastructure find themselves tied to China, not just in debt, but in logistics. Their goods flow through Chinese-built channels. Their markets are accessed through Chinese finance corridors, and their growth becomes aligned with China's capacity to sustain these networks. It is not coercion in the traditional sense, but it is a form of binding influence stronger than treaties or alliances. Technology has deepened the silent weapon further. Supply chains are no longer just about physical goods, but also about digital infrastructure. Nations adopting Chinese 5G networks or surveillance systems find themselves reliant not only on physical trade, but also on technological continuity. This creates another layer of dependence, one that is embedded in communication, finance, and governance. Once integrated, disentangling from these systems becomes nearly impossible without severe disruption. The silent weapon extends beyond ports and ships into code, servers, and networks, ensuring that dependence operates on every level of modern life. Western nations have tried to counter this leverage with policies, sanctions, and calls for reshoring. Yet, even these efforts reveal the depth of the entanglement. To move production out of China requires rebuilding entire supply chains, retraining workforces, and reconstructing infrastructure at immense cost. To reduce reliance on Chinese markets means sacrificing revenue streams that corporations are unwilling to give up. The more governments talk of independence, the more businesses push back, reminding them that profitability is inseparable from Chinese engagement. This tension reveals the genius of the weapon. It forces adversaries into conflict, not with China, but with themselves, torn between political goals and economic survival. Another dimension of this strategy is its quietness. Unlike military weapons, which must be brandished to deter, this weapon requires no display. Its effectiveness grows in silence, in the routine of commerce, in the everyday operations of global trade. It is not noticed in times of smooth functioning. It is only felt in times of disruption. That makes it both subtle and devastating, a power that is always present but rarely acknowledged until it becomes unavoidable. For developing countries, this dependence has another layer of complexity. Many of them see Chinese trade not as a weapon, but as an opportunity. Chinese investment brings jobs, infrastructure, and access to global markets. Yet, in embracing these benefits, they also accept the reality of reliance. Their economies become tied to the stability of Chinese demand, their industries to the supply of Chinese components, their futures to the continuation of Chinese financing. This dependence gives China a voice in their policies, a seat at their tables, and a weight in their decisions that no military presence could ever achieve. What makes this weapon unassailable by armies is its universality. Nations cannot fight what they need. They cannot wage war on their own supply chains. They cannot declare independence from the goods that fill their shelves, the markets that sustain their corporations, or the infrastructure that carries their trade. The stronger the ties of commerce become, the weaker the possibility of confrontation grows. Even those who speak loudly of rivalry and resistance find themselves drawn back into negotiations, into trade deals, into agreements that perpetuate the very dependence they criticize. This is the paradox of modern power. The more interconnected the world becomes, the more vulnerable it is to those who control the connections. China, by embedding itself as the central hub of these connections, has turned dependence into dominance. This is not a weapon that requires threats or ultimatums. It is a weapon that works through silence, through necessity, through inevitability. It is a weapon that leaves no battlefield, no declaration of war, no headline of victory. It simply exists, woven into the everyday functioning of the world's economies, too vital to remove, too dangerous to confront, and too deeply entrenched to ignore. When people talk about power, they usually talk about what can be measured. They count armies, tally up GDP figures, compare export numbers, and track how many skyscrapers dominate a skyline. Yet the most decisive elements of power often exist in places that cannot be counted, in areas too subtle to fit neatly into statistics. China's rise is the clearest proof of this. While the outside world obsessed over surface-level metrics, it missed the foundations being laid quietly in the unseen spaces. The true strength of China's ascent was not only in factories, trade surpluses, or infrastructure projects. It was in the invisible forces that outsiders consistently ignored or underestimated. Cultural values that shaped resilience, networks that created influence, and long-term visions that guided decisions decades before their outcomes could even be imagined. Values formed the first layer of this unseen strength. For centuries, Chinese society was molded by philosophies that emphasized patience, discipline, and collective responsibility. These values did not vanish in the modern age. Instead, they were reinterpreted to meet the demands of a global economy, where Western societies often emphasized the individual above all. China leaned into the power of collective effort. Citizens were encouraged to sacrifice in the present for a stronger future. Entire generations were asked to endure rapid industrialization, environmental challenges, and social upheaval with the understanding that their hardships were investments in national revival. Outsiders saw this as suppression, but they misunderstood its depth. It was not blind obedience, it was cultural continuity, a deeply rooted belief that progress was not just personal, but shared, and that endurance today could create prosperity tomorrow. This collective mindset became a hidden engine, driving levels of commitment and unity that nations fractured by individualism could rarely sustain. Networks formed the second layer. China's global strategy was not built through declarations, but through relationships. The Belt and Road Initiative is often described as an infrastructure program, but at its core, it is a web of networks, economic, political, and cultural, that tie dozens of nations directly to China. Ports, roads, and railways are visible, but behind them are contracts, agreements, and personal relationships forged over years. These connections extend beyond governments to include businesses, universities, and communities. Chinese companies do not simply build a factory abroad. They establish long-term partnerships, supply chains, and educational exchanges that embed them into the local fabric. This creates a kind of influence that armies cannot achieve. It is not dominance imposed from above, but dependence nurtured from within. By the time rivals notice, these networks are too deep to dismantle, too mutually beneficial to sever, and too complex to unravel. The unseen networks also operate within China itself. Domestic ecosystems are so tightly woven that they create resilience against external shocks. Technology companies link payments to communication, communication to commerce, commerce to logistics, and logistics to finance. The result is a system where disruption in one area is quickly absorbed by the strength of others. This interconnection is invisible to outsiders who measure success by company valuations or quarterly growth. They miss the deeper architecture, the ability of networks to reinforce one another and create stability that outlasts crises. When sanctions are applied or markets disrupted, these networks flex, adjust, and find ways to sustain themselves. That adaptability is not visible in balance sheets, but it is the essence of long-term strength. The third and perhaps most profound unseen force is long-term vision. Western nations often view strategy in short bursts, four-year election cycles, quarterly earnings, immediate gains. China, by contrast, thinks in decades, sometimes even centuries. Plans are drafted with horizons that extend beyond the lives of current leaders. Projects are approved not because they will generate instant profits, but because they will secure positioning for the future. A high-speed rail line might lose money today, but create regional dominance tomorrow. A massive investment in green technology might seem unnecessary now, but guarantee leadership in a post-carbon world. This long-term vision is invisible to those who look only at immediate returns. Outsiders see inefficiency or overspending, but what they fail to see is preparation, the careful laying of groundwork for a future in which China is not reacting to change, but shaping it. This vision extends beyond economics into culture and identity. For decades, China quietly cultivated pride in its civilization, reminding its people of centuries of innovation, art, and leadership that predated modern Western dominance. This cultural revival, often overlooked by foreign analysts, created a deep reservoir of confidence. Citizens were not simply told they were working for prosperity. They were reminded they were heirs to a legacy of greatness temporarily interrupted by foreign invasions and colonial humiliation. That sense of mission, of restoring a rightful place in history, became a silent motivator. It inspired patience in times of hardship, resilience in times of struggle, and determination in times of doubt. Outsiders who measured progress only in currency missed the deeper current, a people united by vision, fueled by identity, and anchored in values that stretch back millennia. The unseen also applies to how China leverages knowledge. Every joint venture, every contract with a foreign company, every exchange program was not just about immediate gains, but about learning. Technology transfers, industrial practices, and management techniques were absorbed silently, adapted, and refined. Outsiders often assumed that by engaging with China, they were controlling the process, setting the terms. In reality, they were feeding a vast system designed to absorb knowledge and transform it into domestic capacity. This process was invisible because it did not announce itself with fanfare. It unfolded in training programs, factory floors, and classrooms, accumulating silently until China no longer needed to borrow knowledge, but could generate it independently. Even in global diplomacy, the unseen plays a decisive role. While other nations engage in loud rivalries and public confrontations, China often opts for quiet negotiations, patient alliances, and subtle influence. Its diplomats are less concerned with winning arguments in public forums than with building enduring relationships behind closed doors. This patience often frustrates rivals who expect immediate reactions, but it also allows China to emerge stronger over time. When the world looks back, it realizes that influence was not won through speeches or headlines, but through years of quiet engagement, persistence, and strategic patience. What outsiders miss most of all is how these unseen forces reinforce one another. Values feed into networks. Networks sustain long-term vision. Long-term vision strengthens values. It is a cycle that multiplies strength without drawing attention. This is why so many analysts underestimated China's rise. They were looking for the obvious: armies, declarations, numbers, while the true strength was growing in places they did not measure, in dimensions they did not understand, and in timelines they did not respect. What cannot be seen cannot be countered. What cannot be counted cannot be contained. And what cannot be measured cannot be stopped. The hidden message is embedded in the numbers. The numbers alone never tell the whole story. For years, China's economic growth outpaced that of the West, lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty and creating the world's largest consumer base. Yet, the real message lies not in GDP figures, but in positioning. China is no longer merely producing, it is directing. It is no longer merely participating in globalization, it is shaping it. Its companies are no longer imitators, they are innovators. Its policies are no longer reactive, they are proactive. When a nation reaches this stage, the balance of power has shifted, whether or not rivals admit it. Another reason this truth remains hidden is denial. Those who once held dominance rarely accept its erosion easily. For Western powers, admitting that the balance has shifted would mean acknowledging decades of complacency, miscalculation, and overconfidence. It would mean recognizing that their own corporations, hungry for short-term profits, help build the very system that now challenges them. It would mean confronting the reality that their loud declarations of supremacy were drowned out, not by confrontation, but by quiet preparation. Denial becomes more comfortable than acceptance, and so leaders continue to speak of maintaining dominance as if it were still intact, even as their dependence on China deepens with every passing year. The shift in balance is also cultural. For generations, the West exported not only goods, but also ideas about governance, society, and progress. These ideas shaped much of the modern world. But now, China offers an alternative model. It does not present itself as a global savior or insist on imposing its system on others. Instead, it demonstrates that rapid development, modernization, and global influence can be achieved without adopting Western liberal frameworks. This quiet alternative resonates with many nations that feel alienated by Western demands. The hidden message is not that one system must dominate, but that there is no single path to success. The monopoly of models has ended, and with it, the monopoly of influence. Technology amplifies this message further. The platforms, networks, and ecosystems built in China now stretch far beyond its borders. They shape how people communicate, how they pay, how they trade, and how they connect. These digital ecosystems are not neutral. They carry with them values, practices, and dependencies that reinforce China's position in the global order. Every nation that integrates into these systems becomes part of the new balance, often without realizing it. The shift does not announce itself with flags or declarations. It flows invisibly through fiber optic cables, satellites, and wireless networks. This is power in its modern form, unseen yet inescapable. The hidden message is also revealed in the way crises unfold. When global financial instability strikes, when pandemics spread, when supply chains are disrupted, the world looks to China, not because it declares itself the leader, but because it has become too central to ignore. The ability to restock production, to stabilize markets, to continue exporting becomes a form of leadership in itself. Dependence turns into deference, even if it is not acknowledged publicly. Rivals may criticize, but they cannot disengage. They may challenge, but they cannot isolate. They may resist, but they cannot reverse what has already taken shape. What makes the shift even harder to accept is its subtlety. Power used to change hands in clear and dramatic moments. Wars won, treaties signed, empires collapsing. But this time, the shift has been quiet, unfolding over decades. Disguised as cooperation, framed as development, hidden beneath the surface of global trade. The West mistook this quietness for weakness. In reality, it was the very method by which the shift succeeded. While the world debated when China would rise, China had already risen. While analysts speculated about a future balance of power, that balance was already tilting. While rivals predicted collapse, the foundations of a new order were already in place. The hidden message, then, is not merely about China's strength, but about the blindness of others. Those who cling to the belief that the old order still holds are not just misinformed, they are trapped in outdated frameworks. They search for signs that no longer matter. They measure progress with tools that no longer apply. They fight battles that have already been decided elsewhere. The true battlefield is not in military bases or financial centers, but in the everyday choices of billions who use Chinese goods, rely on Chinese infrastructure, or depend on Chinese networks. The hidden message is delivered in silence, in routine, in necessity, and perhaps the most telling sign of this shift is that it no longer requires acknowledgement. The world does not have to declare that the balance has changed for it to be real. Power does not wait for permission to exist. It asserts itself in outcomes, in realities, in dependencies that cannot be undone. Whether or not leaders admit it, whether or not analysts recognize it, whether or not commentators accept it, the balance of power has already moved. The hidden message is clear for those who are willing to look, and it grows clear with each passing year as the old symbols fade and the new realities become impossible to deny.